Hello Reddit, throwaway account here because this feels weird to share. I 32M, have been holding this in for years, and I guess I need an outside perspective because it's eating at me. My relationship with my younger brother Alex, 27M, has been strained, to say the least, since we were kids. Alex is 5 years younger than me, and somehow he was always the golden child. My mom adored him. No matter what he did, she had this uncanny ability to brush it off as if it was nothing. Meanwhile, I felt like I couldn't sneeze without her criticizing my tone or telling me to be more responsible. Alex was a little terror growing up. He had this mean streak that, looking back, felt intentional, but at the time my mom just called it boys being boys. He would make fun of me constantly, calling me names because of my glasses, saying I looked like a dork, or mocking me whenever I tried to talk about something I cared about. I was into books and video games, and Alex somehow found a way to ruin even that. If I left my games unattended, I'd come back to find he'd deleted my save files or messed up my progress just to see me lose my temper. One time, he crossed a line that I'll never forget. I was around 10, which would make him 5, and we were having tacos for dinner. I went to grab my plate, and he insisted he helped by putting hot sauce on my food. It wasn't just a little, he'd emptied nearly half the bottle onto it, and when I took a bite I started crying because it burned so much. My mom just laughed it off and said, "Oh, come on Mark, he's just a kid. Don't be so dramatic." That's the thing. No matter what Alex did, he was always just a kid. When he messed with my stuff, he doesn't know any better. When he broke something of mine, you should have kept it out of reach. When he bullied me, he's just trying to be close to you in his own way. Felt like I couldn't win. I tried going to my dad a few times, but he was either too busy or just told me to sort it out myself. He wasn't around as much as my mom, so most of the time, it was her ruling the house, and her rule was clear. Alex could do no wrong. As we got older, it didn't get better. Alex found new ways to get under my skin. If I closed my bedroom door, he'd barge in anyway, going through my things and acting like it was no big deal. Personal space, privacy, those concepts didn't exist to him, and apparently they didn't exist to my mom either, because whenever I complained, she just said, "You're brothers. That's what brothers do." It got to the point where I stopped trying to involve my parents. I mean, what was the point? Alex could light my homework on fire, and my mom would probably find a way to say it was my fault for leaving it out in the open. I started keeping to myself more, which only seemed to encourage Alex to push harder, like he could sense that he was getting to me. Looking back, I wonder if I could have handled it differently, but honestly, what do you even do as a kid when the people who are supposed to have your back don't take you seriously? It felt like my entire childhood was a game of survival, trying to navigate around Alex's antics while knowing my mom would never take my side. It was exhausting, and even now, as an adult, I still feel the weight of it. I know siblings fight, and I know kids can be mean, but this didn't feel like normal sibling rivalry. It felt like he was always trying to put me in my place, and I was the only one who noticed. Am I crazy for thinking this wasn't okay? Growing up, I felt like I was on my own when it came to Alex. My mom always had an excuse for his behavior, and my dad, George, was usually too busy or just didn't want to get involved. But one day, something finally snapped in him, and honestly, it changed everything. I was 16, and Alex was 11 at the time. He'd been ramping up his stunts, probably because I was starting to fight back more, verbally at least. I'd stopped trying to involve my mom and was just gritting my teeth and standing my ground. But Alex didn't like that. I guess he enjoyed having the upper hand, and when I stopped letting him get to me with words, he escalated. One night, I was sitting in the living room doing my homework. Alex came in, smirking like he always did when he was up to something. He had this weird look in his eyes that put me on edge immediately. I ignored him at first, but then I felt this tug on the back of my head. Before I could react, I smelled it, burning. Alex had lit the end of a matchstick and held it against my hair. I jumped up so fast that I knocked over the chair. My heart was pounding, and I ran to the bathroom to put out the smoldering ends of my hair. Luckily, it wasn't too bad. It didn't even reach my scalp, but the smell was horrible, and the shock of it left me shaking. When I came back out, my dad was standing in the doorway, looking at Alex with this expression I'd never seen before. My dad was a quiet guy, but in that moment he looked furious. "What the hell is wrong with you?" he yelled at Alex. My mom came rushing in, of course, already trying to downplay it. "George, calm down. He's just a kid. He doesn't know what he's doing." But for once, my dad wasn't having it. "He's old enough to know better," he snapped. "Do you even realize how dangerous that was? If Mark had been seriously hurt, you'd be explaining this to the cops." The word cops seemed to hit everyone in the room like a lightning bolt. Alex looked genuinely scared for the first time, and even my mom went quiet. My dad turned to me and said, "Mark, you're going to start standing up for yourself. Do you hear me? I won't always be here to stop this nonsense." It was the first time I felt like someone in my family actually saw me. Not just as the older brother who should know better, but as a kid who didn't deserve to be treated like a punching bag. That moment stuck with me. My dad didn't say much more about it after that, but it planted a seed in my mind. I realized that if I didn't take control of my situation, no one else was going to do it for me. A few weeks later, I signed up for martial arts classes at a local gym. My dad was surprisingly supportive, even though he didn't really talk about what had happened. He just handed me some cash and said, "Use this for the registration fee." At first, I felt completely out of my depth. I was lanky, awkward, and had zero coordination. But something about the structure of the classes clicked with me. It wasn't just about learning to throw punches or kicks. It was about discipline, control, and confidence. Over the next 2 years, I changed. Physically, I started to bulk up a bit. I wasn't a bodybuilder or anything, but I wasn't the scrawny, glasses-wearing kid Alex used to pick on either. More importantly, though, I changed mentally. Martial arts taught me how to stay calm under pressure. I learned how to hold my ground, not just physically but emotionally. It wasn't easy. There were times when I wanted to quit because it felt like too much. But every time I walked out of that gym, I felt stronger than the day before. Alex noticed the change, too. By the time I turned 18, he wasn't so quick to mess with me anymore. He still tried his little passive-aggressive games, stealing my stuff or making snide comments, but the physical intimidation, that stopped. I think he realized I wasn't afraid of him anymore, and that scared him. Looking back, that moment with my dad was a turning point for me. It was the first time someone had stood up for me in a way that mattered, and it gave me the push I needed to start standing up for myself. Funny thing is, I don't think my dad even realized how much of an impact he had on me that night. But I'll never forget it. That was the moment I decided I wasn't going to be a victim anymore. Getting into university felt like I was finally escaping the prison of my childhood. At 21, I left home for good when I got a scholarship to a prestigious university in New York. I packed up my life, left behind Alex and my parents, and never looked back. It wasn't just about getting an education. It was about starting fresh, away from all the toxicity I'd grown up with. New York was everything I dreamed it would be. Loud, chaotic, and alive. For the first time, I could breathe. No one there knew about my past or the years of dealing with Alex's cruelty and my mom's enabling. I was just Mark, the guy trying to make something of himself. I threw myself into my studies, determined not to waste the opportunity. The scholarship was a lifeline, and I wasn't about to let it slip through my fingers. But university wasn't just about classes. It was also where I started to discover who I was outside of my family. I made friends, joined clubs, and for the first time started to feel like I belonged somewhere. That's when I met Emily. We were both 22, introduced by mutual friends at a student party. I wasn't even planning to go to the party. It was during finals week, and I'd convinced myself I didn't have time for distractions. But one of my roommates dragged me out, saying I needed a break. Emily caught my eye the moment I walked in. She had this infectious energy, laughing loudly and lighting up the room without even trying. We ended up talking for hours that night, sitting on the couch while the party buzzed around us. She was studying psychology, and she had this way of listening that made you feel like you were the only person in the world. We started dating not long after that. Felt easy in a way I hadn't expected. Emily was warm, kind, and genuinely interested in me. Not just the surface stuff, but the parts of me I'd always kept hidden. I didn't tell her everything about my childhood right away, but I didn't have to. She could tell I'd been through some things, and she never pushed me to share more than I was ready to. 2 years later, our relationship took a turn we hadn't planned for. Emily found out she was pregnant. It wasn't something we talked about yet. We were both still figuring out our careers and our future, but once the initial shock wore off, we knew we wanted to keep the baby. We got married in a small ceremony a few months later. It wasn't some grand event. It was just us, a handful of friends, and a courthouse. But it felt right. Emily was my anchor, the person who made me feel like I could finally build the life I'd always wanted. Looking back, that time in my life felt like the first chapter of something good. For the first time, I was happy, truly happy, and I thought I'd left all the pain of my past behind me. But life has a way of bringing old ghosts back when you least expect it. Marriage was supposed to be the start of my happily ever after. I'd left behind the chaos of my childhood, married the woman I loved, and was building a life with Emily and our son, Lucas. For the first few years, everything seemed perfect, or at least I convinced myself it was. Lucas was born when Emily and I were 25. I can't even describe what it felt like to hold him for the first time. He was this tiny, perfect human, and I promised myself I'd do whatever it took to give him a good life. I didn't want him to grow up in a house filled with tension and favoritism, the way I had. But the cracks in our marriage started to show not long after Lucas was born. I noticed Emily was distant sometimes, distracted in a way I couldn't quite put my finger on. At first, I thought it was just the stress of being new parents. We were both tired all the time, juggling work, late-night feedings, and trying to figure out how to be adults while raising a baby. But then, the distance between us started to feel like more than just stress. The first betrayal came out of nowhere. Emily was working at a marketing firm, and she'd always been friendly with her coworkers. She talked about them often, her boss, the other team members, and this one guy, Chris, who she seemed to mention more than the others. At the time, I didn't think much of it. I trusted her. One night, she came home late from a work event. She said she'd been out with her team, celebrating a big project they'd finished. I didn't question her at first, but something felt off. She wasn't making eye contact, and her explanations felt rehearsed, like she was trying too hard to sound casual. A week later, I found out the truth. Chris was married, but that hadn't stopped him and Emily from hooking up after the event. I don't even know how I found the courage to confront her, but when I did, she admitted everything. She cried, apologized, and said it was a mistake. A one-time thing that didn't mean anything. I was devastated. I couldn't believe the woman I loved, the mother of my son, had done this to me. I thought about leaving. I thought about taking Lucas and walking away. But every time I looked at him, I felt this overwhelming need to keep our family together. I didn't want him to grow up in a broken home. So, against my better judgment, I forgave her. Forgiving Emily wasn't easy, and things weren't the same after that. I tried to move past it, but there was this nagging doubt in the back of my mind that I couldn't shake. I started wondering every time she went out or stayed late at work. She promised me she'd never do anything like that again, but the trust we'd built was shattered. For a while, things seemed to improve. Emily made an effort to show she was committed to our family, and I let myself believe we could get back to where we'd been before. Then, a year later, it happened again. Emily went back to her hometown for a long weekend, supposedly to visit her parents and catch up with old friends. I didn't think much of it. She'd done this a few times before, and I wanted her to have some space to reconnect with her family. But when she came back, something felt wrong. She was overly cheerful, almost like she was overcompensating for something. A month later, I found out the truth. One of her friends let it slip that she'd run into Emily and her ex-boyfriend, Tyler, while she was home. Emily tried to deny it at first, but when I pushed, she admitted she'd slept with him. She said it was a mistake, that seeing him had brought up old feelings, but she swore it didn't mean anything. I don't know what hurt more, the betrayal itself or the fact that it had happened again. I felt like an idiot for forgiving her the first time, and now here I was, facing the same situation all over again. I thought about leaving, but Lucas was 2 years old by then. He was starting to talk, starting to recognize the world around him, and I couldn't bear the thought of him growing up without both parents in his life. I told myself I could make it work for his sake, even if it meant swallowing my pride and pretending everything was fine. So I forgave her. Again. Looking back, I'm not sure if it was strength or weakness that kept me there. Maybe it was both. I wanted so badly to believe that Emily could change, that we could still have the family I'd always dreamed of. But part of me knew deep down that things were never going to be the same. It was like a piece of my heart had been chipped away, and no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't put it back together. By the time we hit 7 years of marriage, I thought Emily and I had made it through the worst. I'd forgiven her for the 2 affairs, though the scars they left never really healed. I stayed for Lucas, telling myself I could endure anything for him. He was my anchor, the reason I got up every morning, the one thing that made all the pain feel worth it. Then Emily dropped a bombshell that shattered everything I thought I knew about my life. It was a quiet evening, the kind that used to feel comforting. Lucas, now 5, was playing with his toys in the living room while I cleaned up after dinner. Emily sat at the table, unusually quiet. I didn't think much of it at first. She'd always had her moments of brooding. But then she said my name. "Mark, we need to talk." Those words instantly put me on edge. They weren't the casual, "Hey, let's talk about something" kind of words. They were the kind that signaled something big, something awful. She hesitated, her hands trembling as she picked at the edge of the table. I stood frozen in the kitchen, clutching a dish rag, not ready for what she was about to say. "I've been hiding something from you for years," she said. My chest tightened. "What is it, Emily?" She looked up at me, tears in her eyes, and I knew whatever it was going to destroy me. "I had an affair," she said quietly, her voice cracking. "A long-term one." I stared at her, trying to process her words. My mind immediately jumped to Chris or Tyler, but what she said next knocked the wind out of me. "It was with Alex," she whispered. I thought I misheard her. "What? Alex?" "My brother Alex." She nodded, sobbing now. "It started years ago, before we even got married. I didn't know how to stop it, and I didn't want to hurt you." My mind raced, trying to comprehend what she was saying. This wasn't just another random guy. This was my brother. The person who'd tormented me my entire childhood. The one person I tried so hard to get away from. "And there's more," she continued, barely able to get the words out. "Mark Lucas. He might not be yours." Felt like the ground had been ripped out from under me. Couldn't breathe. My whole world started spinning. "What do you mean, might not be mine?" I asked, my voice shaking. She looked down, unable to meet my eyes. "Alex and we were together right before I found out I was pregnant. I didn't know for sure, but I convinced myself it didn't matter. I didn't think you'd ever find out. I didn't even realize I'd dropped the dish rag until it hit the floor." Lucas's laughter echoed from the living room, completely unaware of the storm tearing through my heart. I couldn't let it go unanswered. I needed the truth, no matter how much it hurt. The next day, I went to a clinic and had a DNA test done. Emily didn't fight me on it. She knew there was no point. I waited for what felt like an eternity for the results, my stomach in knots the entire time. When the results came back, I already knew what they would say. Lucas wasn't mine. Alex was his biological father. I didn't cry when I saw the results. I didn't yell or break anything. I just sat there in stunned silence, staring at the paper like it was written in a foreign language. Everything I thought I knew, my marriage, my family, my role as a father, was a lie. I confronted Emily later that night. She begged for forgiveness, saying she'd been weak and that she regretted everything. She swore she loved me, that she wanted to fix things and keep our family together. But how could I even begin to believe her? And Alex? I couldn't even bring myself to call him. The rage I felt toward him was something I'd never experienced before. It wasn't just anger. It was betrayal on a level I didn't know existed. The worst part was Lucas. I still loved him more than anything in the world. But now I didn't know where I stood. I wasn't his biological father, but I'd raised him, cared for him, been there for him in ways Alex never would have. He was my son, no matter what some tests said. But knowing the truth made everything so much more complicated. I felt like my entire life had been ripped apart, and I had no idea how to put the pieces back together. The day I got the DNA results was the day I knew my marriage was over. There was no coming back from this. I couldn't look at Emily without feeling disgusted, and as much as it tore me apart, I couldn't look at Lucas without thinking about the betrayal. I filed for divorce immediately. Emily tried to argue, saying we should work things out for the sake of Lucas, but her words felt hollow. There was nothing left to fix. For years, I tried to hold our family together, forgiving her betrayals and putting Lucas's well-being above my own. But this was a level of deceit I couldn't forgive. The divorce process was ugly. Emily's first move was to demand child support, which felt like a slap in the face considering everything she'd done. She tried to argue that I'd been a father figure to Lucas and that I had a responsibility to him, but my lawyer quickly shut that down. Her infidelity worked in my favor. The DNA test results and the revelation of her long-term affair with Alex painted a clear picture for the court. It was obvious I wasn't Lucas's biological father and had been deceived into thinking I was. That, combined with the proof of her multiple affairs, ensured she couldn't pin any financial responsibility on me. Still, none of it felt like a victory. The whole process was draining, and every time I had to see her in court, I was reminded of everything she'd taken from me. The hardest part was Lucas. He didn't understand what was happening. How could he? He was just a little boy who wanted his dad to come home, and I couldn't bring myself to explain why I couldn't be that for him anymore. Every time I thought about reaching out, I remembered how he came to be, how he was a product of Emily and Alex's betrayal, and the pain became unbearable. Cutting contact with Lucas was the hardest decision I've ever made. I told myself it was for the best, that it would be better for him to grow up without me than to live in a constant shadow of my resentment. But even now, I question if I did the right thing. The divorce was finalized within a few months, and I walked away with nothing but my freedom. Emily got full custody of Lucas, and I severed all ties with her and Alex. I blocked them both on everything: social media, phone numbers, email. I wanted nothing to do with them ever again. For a while, I didn't know how to move forward. The life I'd built, the family I thought I had, was gone. I was angry, broken, and unsure if I'd ever trust anyone again. But slowly, I started to rebuild. I poured myself into work, therapy, and reconnecting with old friends I'd pushed away during my marriage. It wasn't easy, but piece by piece, I started to feel like myself again. I still carry the scars of what happened, and I'm not sure they'll ever fully heal. Some days I think about Lucas and wonder how he's doing. I hope he's happy, that he's growing up surrounded by love. But I also hope that one day he'll understand why I had to walk away. As for Emily and Alex, I don't know where they are or what they're doing, and I don't care to find out. They made their choices and I've made mine. All I can do now is focus on the future and hope that someday I'll find peace. After the divorce, I knew I couldn't stay silent about what had happened. It wasn't just my story to carry. It was a betrayal that involved my entire family. Alex needed to face the consequences of his actions, and so I told my parents everything. I didn't sugarcoat it. I explained how Emily had been cheating on me for years with Alex, how Lucas wasn't biologically mine, and how the two of them had lied to me every step of the way. My dad's reaction was immediate and explosive. "What the hell is wrong with him?" he yelled, pacing the living room like a caged animal. My dad wasn't an overly emotional man, but when he got angry, it was like a storm. His face turned red, his hands clenched into fists, and his voice echoed through the house. He didn't even try to defend Alex. For once, there were no excuses, no attempts to downplay what had happened. "I didn't raise him to be like this," he said, shaking his head in disbelief. "He's not my son anymore." I don't know if he meant those words in the heat of the moment or if he truly felt them, but either way, it was clear that Alex had crossed a line my dad couldn't forgive. My mom, on the other hand, was harder to read. At first, she tried to defend Alex just like she always had. "Maybe it's not as bad as you're making it out to be," she said, her voice shaky. "We don't know the full story, but I wasn't having it. Mom, he ruined my marriage. He fathered a child with my wife. What part of this isn't as bad as I'm making it out to be?" She didn't have an answer for that. I think, Deep down, she knew there was no way to justify what Alex had done, but admitting that was hard for her. He'd always been her golden boy, the one she protected at all costs. Letting go of that image wasn't something she could do overnight. It was my dad who made the final call. He told Alex he was on his own from now on, no financial support, no college fund, no safety net. My dad had been setting aside money for years to help Alex pay for school, a fund that had grown to around $150,000. Now, that money was completely off the table. When Alex found out, he lost it. He called me, screaming about how I'd ruined his life and turned our parents against him. I didn't even let him finish before hanging up. I didn't owe him an explanation or a chance to play the victim. My mom eventually fell in line with my dad's decision. She didn't seem happy about it, but she didn't fight him on it either. I think she finally realized that Alex had gone too far, that there were consequences even she couldn't shield him from. From what I heard, Alex struggled after being cut off. He had no way to pay for college and ended up dropping out. He tried to reach out to my dad a few times, but my dad refused to speak to him. He made his choices, he told me one day. Now he has to live with them. As much as I'd spent my life resenting Alex, it didn't feel good to see him fall apart. He was still my brother, and there was a part of me that wanted to feel sorry for him. But every time I thought about Lucas, about the lies, about the years I'd spent being deceived, that sympathy disappeared. Alex had made his bed, and now he had to lie in it. My relationship with my parents shifted after that. My dad and I grew closer in a way we hadn't been before. For the first time, I felt like he truly saw me, like he understood the pain I'd been carrying all those years. My mom and I were more cautious with each other. She tried to reach out, but there was always this unspoken tension between us, a lingering sense of mistrust that neither of us knew how to address. As for Alex, I haven't spoken to him since. He's out there somewhere, living with the consequences of his actions, but he's no longer a part of my life. I don't think he ever will be again. After the dust settled, I knew I had to leave New York. There were too many memories tied to that city. Memories of Emily, Lucas, and the life I thought I had. So, I packed up and moved to Boston, determined to start fresh. My new apartment wasn't anything fancy. A modest one-bedroom in a quiet neighborhood. But it was mine. For the first time in years, I felt like I could breathe without the weight of my past pressing down on me. I threw myself into work, taking on extra projects and putting in long hours. The distraction helped, and after a few months I got a promotion. It wasn't just about the money, though that didn't hurt. It was about proving to myself that I could rebuild, that I could thrive despite everything I'd been through. Therapy became another pillar of my new life. At first, it was hard to open up, but my therapist helped me unpack the years of pain, betrayal, and resentment I'd been carrying. We talked about my childhood, about Alex and my parents, and, of course, about Emily and Lucas. Slowly, I began to understand how deeply those experiences had shaped me, and how they didn't have to define me forever. A few months into my new life, my dad called me with unexpected news. "Mark," he said, his voice steady but serious, "I've made some changes to my will." I didn't know what to expect, so I stayed quiet, letting him continue. "I've decided to leave everything to you. The house, the savings, everything. Alex, well, he'll get $1. That's all." I was stunned. My dad wasn't the kind of man to make rash decisions, so I knew he'd thought this through. Still, I couldn't help but feel conflicted. "Are you sure about this?" I asked. "I mean, he's still your son." "He stopped being my son the moment he betrayed you," my dad said firmly. "This isn't about revenge, Mark. It's about accountability. He made his choices, and now he has to live with them." It was hard to argue with that, especially considering everything Alex had done. My dad's decision felt like a way to finally right the wrongs that had been allowed to fester for so long. As for Alex, his life had taken a drastic turn. Cut off from my parents and abandoned by most of our extended family, he'd been forced to drop out of college and find work as an auto mechanic. From what I heard through mutual acquaintances, he was living with Emily now. The thought of the two of them together made me sick, but I refused to waste energy thinking about their lives. They'd made their choices, and I was done letting them take up space in my head. Instead, I focused on myself. Therapy was helping me come to terms with everything, and I was learning how to set boundaries and prioritize my own happiness. I started reconnecting with old friends and even picked up a new hobby, rock climbing of all things. It gave me a sense of freedom and control that I hadn't felt in years. For the first time in a long time, I felt hopeful about the future. My past was still there, a part of me I couldn't erase, but it no longer controlled me. I was building something new, something better, and for the first time I felt like I was truly living. The money my dad promised was a weighty thing to think about, but it wasn't what mattered most to me. What mattered was that I'd finally found my footing, that I was finally free of the toxic people and situations that had held me back for so long. As for Alex and Emily, they were no longer my concern. They were ghosts of a life I'd left behind, and I was determined to keep it that way. My focus was on moving forward, on building a life that was truly mine.